What would you do if a classroom full of teenagers thought they could break a substitute teacher? The students at Riverside High had no idea that the quiet woman with graying hair standing at the front of their classroom had spent 15 years in military combat zones. They were about to learn the hardest lesson of their lives. Maria Santos adjusted her reading glasses and surveyed the chaotic scene before her. Room 247 buzzed with the particular energy that emerged when teenagers sensed weakness. Crumpled papers littered the floor. Desks were arranged haphazardly, and the whiteboard bore crude drawings left by the previous class. At 42, Maria possessed an understated presence that made her nearly invisible in the bustling hallways of this suburban school district. Her petite frame stood barely 5 feet 4 inches, and her conservative cardigan and sensible flats suggested someone more comfortable in a library than commanding respect from rebellious adolescents. The morning sun streamed through dust-covered windows, casting long shadows across the classroom as Maria quietly organized her materials. Her movements were precise and economical, though she deliberately softened her natural bearing to appear less authoritative. After 18 months of substitute teaching, she had learned that projecting strength too early often created unnecessary confrontation. Better to observe, assess, and adapt than to establish dominance through intimidation. Her teaching bag contained the usual supplies: lesson plans left by the absent teacher, extra pencils, tissues, and a thermos of coffee that would barely last until lunch. Hidden beneath educational materials lay a photograph she carried everywhere, her military unit standing proud after completing a particularly dangerous mission in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had commanded respect through competence and courage, but that woman seemed like a distant memory now. The career change hadn't been voluntary. An IED explosion had ended her military service abruptly, leaving her with a partially reconstructed knee and recurring nightmares that made civilian life feel like navigating foreign territory. The VA counselor had suggested teaching as a way to serve others while maintaining structure and purpose. What the counselor hadn't mentioned was how utterly different commanding trained soldiers was from managing hormone-driven teenagers who viewed substitute teachers as entertainment rather than authority figures. Maria had chosen this particular school district because of its reputation for stability and resources. Riverside High served middle-class families who valued education, or so the recruitment materials claimed. The reality proved more complex. Beneath the manicured campus and impressive test scores lurked the same social dynamics that plagued schools everywhere: cliques, bullying, academic pressure, and students who had learned that substitute teachers represented a day off from real learning. Her first few weeks had established a pattern. Students would test boundaries, she would maintain professional calm, and eventually, most would settle into grudging cooperation. Some classes were easier than others, but she had developed strategies for managing even the most challenging groups. Quiet persistence usually won over confrontation, and she had grown skilled at deflecting disrespect without escalating situations. The teaching profession demanded skills she had never needed in the military. Soldiers followed orders because discipline was literally a matter of life and death. Teenagers followed suggestions only when they felt like it, and their consequences rarely extended beyond detention or parent conferences. Maria found herself missing the clarity of military hierarchy, where respect flowed from rank and competence rather than popularity contests and social manipulation. Her martial arts training had actually begun during her military service. Initially motivated by practical self-defense needs, she had discovered an unexpected passion for the discipline and philosophy underlying various fighting styles. Years of dedicated practice had earned her black belts in both Taekwondo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, though she rarely discussed these achievements with civilian colleagues. The physical training provided an outlet for stress and anxiety while maintaining the fitness standards she had internalized during military service. The decision To keep her background private had been deliberate. Fellow teachers often viewed military veterans with a mixture of respect and apprehension, unsure how to relate to someone whose previous career involved life-and-death decisions. Students could be even more unpredictable in their reactions, sometimes romanticizing military service or alternatively dismissing it as irrelevant to their academic concerns. Maria had learned that blending in required downplaying the experiences that had shaped her most profoundly. Her apartment reflected this careful balance between past and present. Military medals and commendations remained packed in boxes, while teaching supplies and educational resources occupied visible shelves. The only hint of her previous life was a small American flag and a photograph of her graduating from basic training, both positioned where casual visitors might not notice them immediately. Financial necessity had driven her into substitute teaching rather than pursuing a full teaching credential. The irregular income was challenging, but it provided flexibility to attend therapy appointments and gradually readjust to civilian routines. Long-term planning felt impossible when each day brought new schools, new students, and new challenges that bore no resemblance to the structured environment she had known for 15 years. Some days were genuinely rewarding. Shy students would approach her desk with genuine questions, or she would successfully explain a concept that helped someone understand difficult material. These moments reminded her why education mattered and why teachers deserved more recognition than society typically provided. Other days felt like survival exercises, where maintaining order became more important than delivering instruction. Today would test every skill she had developed, though she couldn't have predicted that as she arranged desks and prepared for the arrival of her most challenging assignment yet. Third period advanced placement history was supposed to be filled with motivated students preparing for college. The reality would prove far different from her expectations, and the quiet woman adjusting her cardigan had no idea that her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to collide with a classroom full of students who mistook gentleness for weakness. The warning bell rang, signaling that students would arrive in 5 minutes. Maria took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders slightly, and prepared to meet whatever challenges awaited. She had survived combat zones and earned respect in the most demanding environments imaginable. Though the teenagers about to enter her classroom would see only a middle-aged substitute teacher who looked like she might cry if they raised their voices too loudly. The classroom door burst open with theatrical force as students poured in like water through a broken dam. Maria watched from behind the teacher's desk, maintaining the gentle smile she had perfected over months of substitute assignments. Her posture remained deliberately relaxed, shoulders slightly rounded to minimize her presence, hands folded peacefully atop the lesson plans that would likely never be opened. She had learned to read groups quickly during her military service, and this particular collection of 17-year-olds radiated the kind of predatory confidence that emerged when pack animals sensed vulnerability. Their designer backpacks hit the floor with calculated carelessness, expensive sneakers were propped on desks with deliberate disrespect, and conversations continued at volumes that acknowledged no authority figure existed in the room. "Another sub," announced a tall blonde girl whose perfectly applied makeup suggested more time spent on appearance than academics. "Looks like we're watching movies today." Her voice carried the particular entitlement that came from never experiencing real consequences for poor behavior. The statement drew immediate agreement from her cluster of followers, who began pulling out phones and earbuds with the assumption that education had been suspended for the day. Maria recognized the social dynamics immediately. Military units had similar hierarchies, though soldiers earned respect through competence rather than family wealth or social media followers. This girl commanded attention through sheer force of personality, and her approval would determine how the rest of the class treated their substitute teacher. The outcome of the next few minutes would establish patterns that would persist throughout the entire period. "Good morning, everyone," Maria said softly, her voice barely audible above the ongoing conversations. "I'm Mrs. Santos, and I'll be covering for Mr. Richardson today." Her introduction was met with continued chatter and the occasional glance that suggested mild annoyance at being interrupted. Several students didn't even acknowledge her presence, maintaining text conversations or scrolling through social media feeds with practiced efficiency. The seating arrangement told its own story about classroom politics. The confident students had claimed the back corners, positioning themselves for maximum disruption potential while maintaining plausible deniability. The front rows remained largely empty except for a few anxious-looking students who clutched notebooks and actually seemed interested in learning. The middle section housed those who would follow whatever direction the dominant personalities established. "Mr. Richardson left detailed lesson plans," Maria continued, raising her voice slightly but maintaining the same gentle tone that had proven ineffective in gaining attention. "We're supposed to discuss the causes of World War I and how they connect to current international relations." The topic should have generated interest from advanced placement students, but it was met with barely concealed eye rolls and theatrical sighs. A boy with carefully styled hair and an expensive Letterman jacket leaned back in his chair until it balanced on two legs. "Yeah, about that," he said with the lazy confidence of someone who had never been told no. "We don't really do work when there's a substitute. It's kind of an unwritten rule." His statement was delivered as though he was explaining basic facts to someone too naive to understand how things really worked. Maria nodded understandingly, her expression remaining patient and accommodating. "I understand that having a substitute can feel like a break from routine," she replied, deliberately choosing words that wouldn't challenge their assumptions. "But Mr. Richardson specifically asked me to cover this material because you have a test next week." Her attempt at compromise was met with theatrical groans and whispered complaints about unfair expectations. The blonde girl, whom Maria had mentally designated as the alpha of this particular pack, examined her manicured nails with exaggerated boredom. "Listen, Mrs. Whatever your name was," she said without looking up, "we're going to need you to understand something. We're advanced placement students. We're smart enough to teach ourselves when we actually need to learn something. Today is not one of those days." Her statement drew murmurs of agreement from the assembled group, and Maria could see the social dynamics crystallizing in real time. Supporting the alpha's position would earn approval and acceptance, while challenging it would result in social exile. The few students who seemed genuinely interested in education kept their eyes down, unwilling to risk their standing by defending academic priorities. Maria maintained her deliberately submissive posture, allowing her shoulders to slump slightly as though accepting defeat. "I suppose we could have a study hall instead," she offered weakly, playing into their expectations of easily manipulated authority. "You could work on assignments for other classes or catch up on reading." The suggestion was designed to sound like a compromise while actually representing complete capitulation to their demands. The response was immediate and predictable. Phones appeared on desks, earbuds were inserted, and conversations resumed at full volume. Maria retreated behind the teacher's desk, ostensibly organizing papers, while actually observing the group dynamics with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in combat zones. Every gesture was calculated to reinforce their perception of her as harmless and ineffective. She noticed the subtle bullying that occurred within their own ranks. A quieter girl attempted to join a conversation, only to be dismissed with barely concealed cruelty. A boy with last season's sneakers was excluded from group discussions about weekend plans that clearly required financial resources he didn't possess. The same students who demanded respect from authority figures showed none to their peers who fell outside their narrow social circles. 20 minutes into the period, their behavior had escalated from passive resistance to active disruption. Paper airplanes sailed across the room, music played from multiple phones simultaneously, and food appeared despite clear school policies against eating in classrooms. Maria continued to project helplessness, occasionally making weak requests for quiet that were immediately ignored. "This is so boring," announced the letterman jacket boy, whose name tag read Connor. "Mrs. Santos, don't you have anything interesting to tell us? Like, what did you do before teaching?" His question was delivered with mock politeness that barely concealed contempt for someone whose life experience he assumed was limited to academic settings. Maria looked up from her papers with a self-deprecating smile that suggested embarrassment about her unremarkable background. "Oh, nothing very exciting," she replied in the same gentle tone she had maintained throughout the period. "I worked in administrative positions before deciding to try teaching." The deliberately vague answer was designed to confirm their assumptions about her boring, insignificant life experience. The blonde girl, whose designer handbag probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent, laughed with practiced cruelty. "Administrative work? Like filing papers and answering phones?" Her question drew immediate laughter from her followers, who seemed to find the idea of such mundane employment hilarious. "No wonder you became a substitute teacher. What else were you going to do with skills like that?" Maria's hands tightened imperceptibly around the papers she was holding, but her expression remained patient and slightly hurt, exactly as they expected. Inside, she was cataloging personalities, identifying leaders and followers, and noting which students might be reached through different approaches. The officer who had led soldiers through hostile territory remained alert. Beneath the carefully constructed facade of defeated resignation, the period continued with escalating disrespect, as students grew more confident in their assessment of their substitute teacher as someone who would neither challenge their behavior nor report it to administration. They had encountered her type before, temporary authority figures, who lacked the backbone to enforce meaningful consequences, and who could be intimidated into compliance through persistence and social pressure. What they couldn't see was the controlled breathing techniques that kept Maria calm, the subtle weight shifts that maintained perfect balance despite appearing relaxed, or the tactical awareness that tracked every movement in the room simultaneously. The woman they dismissed as weak and boring was actually conducting a thorough reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable when circumstances inevitably forced her to abandon her carefully maintained cover. The true test of Maria's resolve arrived with the entrance of 3 students, who had clearly orchestrated their late arrival for maximum impact. The classroom door swung open with deliberate force, and in walked what could only be described as the apex predators of Riverside High's social ecosystem. Their timing was perfect, late enough to disrupt any semblance of order Maria might have established, but not so late as to trigger automatic administrative consequences. Leading the group was Derek Matthews, whose 6'2" frame filled the doorway like a mountain blocking sunlight. His varsity football jacket hung open to reveal a perfectly sculpted physique that spoke of countless hours in the weight room and a metabolism that hadn't yet encountered the realities of adult life. His dark hair was styled with the kind of precision that required significant time and expensive products, and his green eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who had learned that physical intimidation opened doors that charm couldn't reach. Behind Derek stood Marcus Chen, whose deceptively lean build concealed the wiry strength of a wrestling champion. At 5'10", he seemed smaller next to Derek until you noticed the predatory grace with which he moved, every step calculated for maximum efficiency. His black hair was buzzed short in a style that emphasized sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that missed nothing. Marcus was the strategist of the group, the one who identified weaknesses and exploited them with surgical precision. The third member of their trinity was Ryan Walsh, whose red hair and freckled complexion might have made him appear harmless if not for the cruel intelligence that radiated from his pale blue eyes. Standing 5'11" with the broad shoulders of a swimmer, Ryan specialized in psychological warfare, finding the exact words that would inflict maximum emotional damage. His smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous, promising. Pain disguised as humor. "Sorry we're late, Mrs. ... Derek paused dramatically, pretending to search for her name while his eyes swept the classroom to assess the current power dynamics. He noted the scattered phones, the students engaged in private conversations, and Maria's position behind the teacher's desk like a general surveying a battlefield. "Santos, right? We had to handle some urgent business in the principal's office." The lie was delivered with practiced sincerity, and Maria recognized it immediately. These three hadn't been in any meeting with administration. Their body language and timing suggested they had deliberately waited in the hallway until they felt enough disruption had occurred to mask their entrance. They were taking control of a situation that was already chaotic, positioning themselves as leaders rather than followers. "No problem at all," Maria replied with the same gentle voice that had characterized her interactions throughout the period. "Please take your seats and we'll continue with our study hall." Her accommodating response drew immediate smirks from the newcomers, who correctly interpreted her tone as evidence of weakness rather than professional courtesy. Derek surveyed the available seating options with the air of a king choosing a throne. Rather than selecting one of the many empty desks, he walked directly to where a smaller student named Timothy was quietly working on homework. "Mind if I sit here, Tim?" The question was posed politely, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. Timothy immediately gathered his materials and relocated without protest, understanding that resistance would only invite worse treatment later. Marcus and Ryan followed Derek's example, appropriating seats from students who offered no resistance to their territorial claims. The message was clear to everyone in the room. These three operated by different rules than ordinary students, and challenges to their authority would be met with swift and decisive retaliation. Maria watched the displacement occur while maintaining her facade of oblivious helplessness. "So, Mrs. Santos," Marcus said conversationally as he settled into his newly acquired seat, "we heard from Connor that you used to work in administration. That must have been incredibly exciting." His words dripped with sarcasm that drew immediate laughter from his companions and the students who had been testing boundaries all period. Ryan leaned forward with exaggerated interest. "Tell us more about your fascinating career filing papers and organizing supply closets. I bet you have some real thrilling stories about office parties and copying machine malfunctions." His mock enthusiasm was designed to humiliate while maintaining plausible deniability. He was just showing interest in her background. After all, the blonde girl, whose name Maria had learned was Ashley, immediately aligned herself with the new power structure. "We were just talking about how boring our lives must seem compared to someone with such extensive administrative experience. I mean, answering phones all day must have really prepared you for handling teenagers, right?" Maria's response remained consistent with the character she had been portraying. "Every job teaches you valuable skills," she said mildly, her voice carrying a slight tremor that suggested their words were having the desired effect. "I learned a lot about working with different types of people." The answer was designed to sound defensive while avoiding any hint of the leadership experience that had actually shaped her career. Derek stood up abruptly, his height allowing him to loom over the teacher's desk in a way that would intimidate most authority figures. "You know what I think, Mrs. Santos? I think you're scared of us." His voice carried the confident cruelty of someone who had never encountered real consequences for psychological bullying. "I think you know that we could make your life really difficult if we wanted to." The classroom fell silent as other students recognized they were witnessing something more serious than typical substitute teacher harassment. This was a direct challenge to authority that crossed lines most of them wouldn't dare approach. Even the students who had been disrespectful earlier seemed uncomfortable with the escalation, but none were willing to defend someone they perceived as weak. Maria looked up at Derek with wide eyes that suggested genuine fear rather than the tactical assessment she was actually conducting. "I'm just trying to do my job," she said quietly, allowing her voice to shake slightly. "I don't want any trouble with anyone." Her performance was Oscar-worthy, conveying exactly the vulnerability that would encourage further aggression from predators who fed on fear. Marcus joined Derek in standing, creating a wall of intimidation that would have sent most substitute teachers fleeing to the main office. "The thing is," he said with deadly calm, "we don't really care what you want. We care about what we want. And what we want is for you to understand that this is our classroom, not yours." Ryan remained seated, but contributed his own form of psychological pressure. "I heard that substitute teachers who can't control their classes get reported to the district office. Something about being unsuitable for educational environments." His threat was veiled but clear. They could end her employment opportunities with a well-crafted complaint to administration. The three had positioned themselves in a triangle around Maria's desk, using their physical presence to create a sense of enclosure and helplessness. It was a textbook intimidation technique that would have been effective against someone who hadn't spent years dealing with actual threats in combat environments. They were playing at being dangerous while confronting someone who had faced genuinely life-threatening situations with trained killers. Other students watched the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some were clearly enjoying the entertainment value of watching authority being challenged so brazenly. Others seemed troubled by the obvious bullying, but lacked the courage to intervene against such socially powerful aggressors. The few who might have been inclined to help were paralyzed by the understanding that defending an ineffective substitute teacher would make them targets for future retaliation. Ashley provided vocal support for the male trio's intimidation campaign. "Honestly, Mrs. Santos, maybe teaching just isn't for you. Have you considered going back to filing? I'm sure there are plenty of offices that need someone to organize their supply closets." Her contribution drew more laughter and reinforced the pack mentality that was forming around Maria's perceived weakness. The psychological pressure was expertly applied, with each member of the group contributing their own specialized form of cruelty. Derek provided physical intimidation through his imposing presence. Marcus offered calculated threats about consequences. Ryan delivered cutting psychological attacks, and Ashley reinforced their dominance through social validation. Together, they created an environment where resistance seemed futile and submission appeared to be the only rational response. What they couldn't see beneath Maria's carefully constructed facade was the woman who had earned the respect of hardened soldiers through competence under fire, who had survived combat situations that would have broken most people, and who was currently cataloging their weaknesses while planning responses they couldn't imagine. The substitute teacher they thought they were breaking was actually a predator in sheep's clothing, and their aggressive behavior was about to awaken something they were completely unprepared to face. The confrontation escalated when Derek decided that verbal intimidation wasn't producing sufficient entertainment value. With the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, he reached across Maria's desk and swept her carefully arranged papers onto the floor. Lesson plans, attendance sheets, and personal notes scattered like autumn leaves, some sliding under desks where they would be trampled by expensive sneakers. "Oops," Derek said with mock sincerity, his green eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "How clumsy of me. I guess you'll have to crawl around and pick those up now." His suggestion was delivered as though he was offering helpful advice rather than issuing a humiliating command designed to establish absolute dominance over someone he perceived as helpless. Maria stared at the scattered papers for a long moment, her hands gripping the edge of the desk with enough force to whiten her knuckles. The other students held their collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would define the rest of the period. Would she submit completely to their demands, or would she find some spark of resistance that might make the confrontation more interesting? "Please," Maria said softly, her voice carrying the defeated tone of someone whose spirit was being systematically broken. "I need those papers. Mr. Richardson will expect a report about what we covered today." She began to rise from her chair as though preparing to kneel on the floor and gather the scattered documents. Exactly as Derek had intended, Marcus stepped closer, positioning himself so that Maria would have to navigate around his legs to reach some of the papers. "Maybe if you ask nicely, we might let you clean up our mess," he suggested with the tone of someone offering a generous favor. "But you'll have to convince us that you understand who's really in charge here." Ryan contributed his own psychological torture by pulling out his phone and opening the camera app. "This is definitely going on social media," he announced with evident glee. "Substitute teacher gets taught a lesson by students. It'll probably go viral." The threat of public humiliation was designed to compound Maria's distress while providing the group with potential blackmail material for future encounters. Ashley clapped her hands together with theatrical excitement. "Oh my God, yes, we should totally livestream this. My followers would absolutely die watching this pathetic woman beg us to let her do her job." Her enthusiasm for public cruelty revealed the depth of entitlement that characterized her worldview. Other people's suffering was simply content for her social media empire. The smaller acts of cruelty continued as Maria slowly lowered herself toward the floor. Connor kicked one of the papers further away just as she reached for it, forcing her to stretch uncomfortably to retrieve it. Timothy, emboldened by the group's behavior, stepped on another document as though by accident, leaving a dirty sneaker print across the middle of an attendance form. "You know what I think?" Derek mused as he watched Maria crawl between desks to gather the scattered materials. "I think Mrs. Santos learned her administration skills by being everyone's secretary. Probably spent years fetching coffee and making copies for people who were actually important." His psychological profiling was designed to strip away any remaining dignity, while reinforcing his position as the alpha predator in the room. Maria's movements were deliberately clumsy and submissive as she collected papers, playing perfectly into their expectations of complete defeat. She stumbled slightly when rising from beneath a desk, catching herself against a chair with apparent embarrassment. Her cardigan had become disheveled, her hair showed signs of the crawling she'd been forced to do, and her cheeks were flushed with what appeared to be shame and humiliation. "Are you crying?" Marcus asked with feigned concern as he noticed what looked like moisture in Maria's eyes. "Because honestly, if you can't handle a little criticism from students, teaching probably isn't the career for you. Maybe you should consider something more suited to your limited capabilities." Ryan lowered his phone slightly, pretending to offer helpful advice while continuing to record. "You know, there are lots of jobs for people who don't mind being ordered around. Waitressing, housekeeping, maybe even going back to answering phones. You seem like you'd be good at taking directions from people who are smarter than you." The group's confidence had reached dangerous levels as they interpreted Maria's submission as proof of their complete dominance. They had successfully reduced a figure of authority to someone who crawled on floors at their command, and the intoxication of that power was driving them toward even more extreme behavior. The psychological high of breaking someone's spirit was addictive, and they were chasing an ever-increasing dose of cruelty. Ashley decided to contribute her own form of psychological warfare by addressing the other students in the room. "Everyone. See this? This is what happens when weak people try to do jobs they're not qualified for. Mrs. Santos thought she could come in here and teach us something, but the only lesson she's learning is about knowing your place." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing genuine cruelty rather than harmless rebellion. However, none were willing to challenge the established power dynamic by defending someone who appeared incapable of defending herself. The bystander effect was in full operation as individual moral compasses were overridden by group dynamics and fear of social retaliation. Derek seemed to sense that the entertainment value of humiliation was beginning to diminish, so he escalated to the next level of psychological torture. "You know what, Mrs. Santos? I don't think you've learned your lesson yet. Stand up and tell the whole class that you're not qualified to teach us. Say it loud enough for everyone to hear." The demand crossed a line from disruption into active psychological abuse, requiring Maria to participate in her own degradation for their entertainment. It was the kind of power play that sociopaths use to assert complete dominance over their victims, forcing them to collaborate in their own humiliation while destroying any remaining sense of self-worth. Maria rose slowly from where she had been, gathering papers, her movements suggesting exhaustion and defeat. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed dust from her skirt, and her voice was barely audible when she spoke. I don't think that's necessary," she whispered, her words carrying the desperate hope that reason might penetrate their cruelty. "Oh, but I think it is necessary," Marcus replied with the clinical precision of someone conducting a psychological experiment. "You see, we need to make sure you understand exactly where you stand in the hierarchy here. And right now you're at the bottom, looking up at everyone else." Ryan had moved to a better angle for filming, ensuring that he captured Maria's face clearly as she endured their systematic destruction of her authority and dignity. "Come on, Mrs. Santos," he encouraged with false kindness. "Just say the words, and we can all move on with our day. Admit that you're not good enough to teach students like us." The classroom had become a coliseum where psychological gladiators were forcing their victim to provide entertainment through her own suffering. The other students were no longer participants, but rather an audience watching someone's spirit being methodically broken by experts in teenage cruelty. The silence was broken only by the soft sounds of Maria's labored breathing and the occasional whispered comment from students who were becoming uncomfortable with the escalation, what none of them could see beneath Maria's carefully maintained facade was the woman who had survived interrogation training, who had been taught to endure psychological pressure that made their amateur attempts seem like gentle conversation. The trembling they interpreted as fear was actually controlled fury being held in check by discipline they couldn't comprehend. The defeated woman gathering papers from the floor was conducting a final assessment of threats before deciding whether the situation required the kind of response that would end their bullying permanently. The moment of truth was approaching rapidly. Though the students tormenting her had no way of knowing that their victim was actually a weapon waiting for the safety to be released, the psychological warfare intensified over the following days as Derek, Marcus, and Ryan discovered that their initial success had merely been an appetizer for a feast of cruelty they intended to savor slowly. Word had spread through Riverside High's social networks about the substitute teacher who could be broken with minimal effort, and their classroom had become a destination for students seeking entertainment during their free periods. Maria arrived each morning to find her desk had been vandalized overnight. Someone with access to the building had filled her drawers with shredded paper, poured sticky soda residue across her supplies, and left anonymous notes detailing exactly what the student body thought of her teaching abilities. The messages grew increasingly personal and vicious, attacking everything from her appearance to her perceived intelligence to cruel speculation about her personal life. The administration remained blissfully unaware of the systematic campaign being waged against their substitute teacher. Principal Morgan was dealing with budget crises and standardized testing pressures that left little time for investigating complaints about classroom management. Besides, the students involved were among the school's highest achievers academically and athletically, making their parents influential donors whose goodwill the district needed to maintain. During her second week covering Mr. Richardson's classes, Maria discovered that her tormentors had recruited additional participants for their entertainment. Students from other periods began appearing during passing time to witness the spectacle of an adult being systematically humiliated by teenagers. They gathered in the hallway outside room 247 like tourists visiting a zoo exhibit, peering through the door window to catch glimpses of the latest degradation. Ashley had appointed herself as the social media coordinator for their campaign, creating a private group chat where members could share photos and videos of Maria's daily humiliations. The group, which she had named Teaching the Teacher, grew from the original 3 boys to include over 40 students who contributed their own suggestions for psychological torture methods. The collaborative nature of their cruelty created a sense of community among the participants while isolating Maria even further. The escalation followed a predictable pattern that would have been recognizable to anyone who had studied psychological warfare. Each day brought new boundaries that were tested and crossed, with success encouraging more extreme behavior. What had begun as disrespect for authority had evolved into a systematic campaign designed to destroy Maria's mental health and professional reputation. Connor had become particularly creative in his contributions to the group's efforts. He began timing his bathroom requests to coincide with moments when Maria was trying to deliver actual instruction to the handful of students who still seemed interested in learning. His loud, theatrical disruptions were designed to ensure that no meaningful education could occur while he remained in the classroom. "Mrs. Santos," he would announce in the middle of her attempts to discuss historical concepts, "I'm having a medical emergency. I think I might throw up if I have to listen to any more of this boring lecture." His fake medical crises provided him with opportunities to leave the room while simultaneously insulting her teaching abilities and disrupting other students' learning. Timothy, the smaller student who had been displaced from his seat on the first day, had undergone a disturbing transformation. Initially sympathetic to Maria's plight, he had gradually aligned himself with her tormentors as a survival strategy. His betrayal was particularly cruel because it came from someone she had tried to protect during the early confrontations. "You know what, Mrs. Santos?" Timothy said during one particularly brutal session, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone trying to prove his loyalty to the dominant group. "I used to feel sorry for you, but now I realize that people like you deserve whatever happens to them. You're weak, and weak people get eaten alive in the real world." The few students who maintained any sympathy for Maria's situation were effectively silenced by the social pressure surrounding them. Sarah Kim, an honor student who had initially seemed horrified by the group's behavior, now avoided eye contact entirely and participated in the general atmosphere of disrespect through her silence. Her moral compromise was perhaps more heartbreaking than the active cruelty because it represented the corruption of someone who knew better. Maria's carefully constructed facade of defeat had become so convincing that even she sometimes forgot it was an act. The daily assault on her dignity required her to maintain the appearance of someone whose spirit was being systematically broken, and the psychological toll of pretending to be helpless was more exhausting than any physical challenge she had faced during military service. Her evenings were spent in strategic planning sessions that would have impressed her former commanding officers. She mapped the social relationships within the classroom, identified the primary instigators versus the followers, and analyzed the group dynamics that enabled their behavior to escalate unchecked. The intelligence gathering phase was nearly complete, and she was beginning to formulate response strategies that would address the situation definitively. The breaking point arrived when Derek decided that psychological torture needed to be supplemented with physical intimidation. During her third week of covering the class, he began a campaign of deliberately invading her personal space in ways that couldn't be easily reported to administration. He would stand unnecessarily close when asking questions, brush against her when moving around the classroom, and position himself in ways that made her feel trapped behind the teacher's desk. "You know, Mrs. Santos," Derek said during one particularly uncomfortable encounter, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. About how someone like you ended up in a place like this, trying to do a job you're obviously not qualified for." His voice carried implications that made her skin crawl, and his proximity was designed to make her feel threatened in ways that went beyond professional harassment. Marcus contributed to the physical intimidation campaign, accidentally bumping into her while she was writing on the whiteboard, causing her to stumble and drop her marker. His apologies were theatrical and insincere, designed to draw attention to her clumsiness while providing him with opportunities to make physical contact that walked the line between accident and assault. Ryan's contribution was perhaps the most disturbing because it involved recruiting other students to participate in the physical harassment. He convinced several football players to time their movements through the hallway so that Maria would be jostled and bumped whenever she left the classroom. The coordination required for these accidents demonstrated a level of premeditation that elevated their behavior from bullying to stalking. The final straw came when Ashley decided to escalate from social media harassment to direct personal attacks. She had somehow obtained Maria's phone number and began sending anonymous text messages during evening hours that contained detailed descriptions of the humiliations planned for the following day. The messages were crafted to maximize psychological damage while avoiding language that could be easily traced back to their sender. "Tomorrow we're going to see if we can make you cry in front of everyone," read one particularly vicious message. "I bet you'll break completely when we really start trying. Weak people like you always do." The psychological warfare had extended beyond school hours into Maria's personal time, ensuring that she could never fully escape the stress of anticipating the next day's torment. Maria stared at her phone screen as the latest message arrived, her hands steady despite the fury building inside her chest. The predators circling her had no idea they were about to discover the difference between someone who appeared weak and someone who had simply chosen restraint over violence. Their systematic campaign of psychological torture was about to encounter a level of resistance they couldn't imagine, and the substitute teacher they thought they had broken was preparing to teach them the most important lesson of their privileged lives. The warrior they had never seen was about to emerge from behind the facade of helplessness, and their education in real consequences was about to begin. The trap was set with the precision of a military operation, though Maria's tormentors had no idea they were walking into an ambush of their own making. Friday afternoon brought the perfect storm of circumstances that would finally force her hand. A scheduling conflict had left the hallway near room 247 empty during 7th period. The security cameras in that section were undergoing maintenance, and Principal Morgan was attending a district meeting that would keep him off campus until evening. Derek had spent the lunch period recruiting additional participants for what he promised would be the grand finale of their campaign against the pathetic substitute teacher. His Instagram story featured a countdown timer with the caption, "Operation Breakdown commences in 3 hours," accompanied by laughing emojis and tagged locations that would bring curious spectators to witness Maria's final humiliation. The classroom filled with an unusual number of students as 7th period began, many of whom had no legitimate reason to be there. Ashley had used her social media influence to promote the event as unmissable entertainment, promising her followers that they would witness something that would be talked about for years. The anticipation was electric as teenagers who had grown bored with typical high school drama gathered to watch an adult be systematically destroyed. Maria entered room 247 carrying the same worn teaching bag and wearing another conservative cardigan that reinforced her image as someone who posed no threat to anyone. Her movements remained deliberately subdued, her shoulders curved inward to minimize her presence, and her eyes stayed focused on the floor, as though she was afraid to make contact with any of the hostile faces surrounding her. The harassment began immediately, with Marcus kicking over the trash can near the door as she passed, sending crumpled papers and empty water bottles scattering across the linoleum floor. "Oops," he said with exaggerated innocence. "Looks like someone made a mess." Maybe the cleaning lady should handle that instead of pretending to be a teacher. Ryan had positioned his phone strategically to capture multiple angles of the planned humiliation, while Ashley provided live commentary for her social media followers who were watching the stream remotely. Okay everyone, here she is. Our favorite substitute teacher who thinks she can actually teach us something. Let's see how long it takes to make her quit this time. The psychological pressure intensified as more students crowded into the classroom, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a gladiatorial arena than an educational environment. Derek had orchestrated the seating arrangement so that Maria would be surrounded on all sides, with escape routes blocked by students who were there specifically to witness her breakdown. "Mrs. Santos," Derek announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "we've been talking, and we've decided that you're not really qualified to be here. We think it's time for you to admit that you're a failure and find a different career. Maybe something more suited to your ... limited abilities." The room erupted in cruel laughter as students who had previously remained neutral were swept up in the mob mentality that Derek had carefully cultivated. Even teenagers who might normally have shown basic decency found themselves participating in the collective cruelty because dissent would have made them targets for the same treatment. Maria set her teaching bag down with trembling hands, her movement suggesting someone who was barely holding herself together under the weight of constant harassment. She attempted to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper that was immediately drowned out by the hostile chatter filling the room. "Speak up," shouted Connor from the back of the room. "We can't hear you when you mumble like that. Or maybe you don't have anything interesting to say. I bet that's it." Boring people usually don't have much to contribute to conversations with their intellectual superiors. Marcus stood up and walked deliberately toward Maria's desk, his movements calculated to maximize intimidation while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. "You know what I think, Mrs. Santos? I think you're scared of us. I think you know that we're smarter, stronger, and better than you in every way that matters." The circle was tightening as other students rose from their seats to join the confrontation, creating a wall of hostile bodies that surrounded Maria completely. She was trapped behind the teacher's desk with nowhere to retreat, exactly as Derek had planned when he orchestrated the seating arrangement and timing of the ambush. "Here's what's going to happen," Derek announced with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "You're going to stand up, pack your things, and walk out of this school forever. Because if you don't, we're going to make your life so miserable that you'll wish you had never been born." Ashley moved closer with her phone camera active, eager to capture the moment when Maria's spirit finally broke completely. This is it, everyone. This is where she finally realizes that she doesn't belong here. Say goodbye to the worst substitute teacher in Riverside High history. Ryan contributed his own psychological warfare by pulling out printouts of the cruel messages that had been sent to Maria's phone. "We even have some bedtime reading for you, Mrs. Santos, just in case you forget how pathetic you are when you go home to your sad little life tonight." The mob mentality had reached its peak intensity as students, who had individually shown some capacity for empathy, were transformed into a pack of predators feeding off shared cruelty. The social pressure to participate was overwhelming, and the few who might have objected were silenced by fear of becoming targets themselves. Maria remained frozen behind her desk, apparently paralyzed by the intensity of the assault on her dignity and professional authority. Her hands gripped the edge of the desktop with white-knuckled intensity, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid in a way that suggested someone on the verge of a complete psychological breakdown. "Come on, Mrs. Santos," Marcus taunted, as he leaned across her desk, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers. "Just say the words. Admit that you're not good enough to teach students like us. Tell everyone that you're a failure who doesn't deserve to be here." The classroom had become a pressure cooker of teenage cruelty that was about to explode with devastating consequences for everyone involved. What the students couldn't see beneath Maria's carefully maintained facade was the tactical assessment, being conducted by someone who had survived situations far more dangerous than anything these privileged teenagers could imagine. The breathing they interpreted as panic was actually a controlled technique for managing adrenaline that she had learned during combat training. The trembling they saw as fear was muscle preparation for explosive action. The apparent paralysis was actually perfect stillness that preceded lightning-fast movement. Derek decided that verbal intimidation wasn't producing the complete breakdown he had promised his audience, so he reached across the desk to grab Maria's teaching bag with the intention of dumping its contents on the floor. "Let's see what exciting supplies our substitute teacher brought to share with us today," he announced with malicious glee. His hand was 6 inches from the bag when Maria moved. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The trembling woman who had been cowering behind the teacher's desk vanished, replaced by someone whose presence filled the room with an authority that silenced 40 hostile teenagers in a single heartbeat. Her posture straightened to military attention. Her eyes locked onto Derek's face with the focused intensity of a predator identifying prey, and her voice carried the unmistakable command authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Remove your hand from my desk," she said quietly. But her words carried across the suddenly silent classroom with the weight of an order that brooked no disobedience. "Remove it now." Derek's hand froze in mid-reach, his fingers suspended inches from Maria's bag, as though he had encountered an invisible force field. The change in her voice had been so sudden and complete that his brain struggled to process what was happening. This was not the same woman who had been gathering papers from the floor just days earlier, and every instinct he possessed was suddenly screaming warnings that he was completely unprepared to understand. The silence in the classroom was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the barely audible sound of 40 teenagers holding their breath simultaneously. Students who had been laughing and jeering moments before found themselves unable to speak, their vocal cords apparently paralyzed by the shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanied Maria's transformation. "I said remove your hand," Maria repeated, her voice carrying the same quiet intensity, but with an undertone that suggested consequences for disobedience that went far beyond detention or suspension. Her brown eyes, which had seemed gentle and defeated behind wire-rimmed glasses, now held the focused intensity of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Derek's hand slowly withdrew from its position above the desk, though he seemed unaware that he was moving. His green eyes, which had sparkled with cruel confidence throughout weeks of psychological torture, now showed the first glimmers of uncertainty as his subconscious mind recognized something his conscious thoughts couldn't quite grasp. Marcus, who had been standing beside Derek in preparation for the final phase of their planned humiliation, took an involuntary step backward. His wrestler's instincts were detecting changes in body language and energy that his rational mind couldn't explain. The woman in front of them was occupying space differently now, her presence somehow larger despite her unchanged physical dimensions. "Sit down," Maria commanded, her voice never rising above conversational volume but carrying an authority that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the survival instincts buried deep in human DNA. "All of you, sit down right now." The response was immediate and involuntary. Students who had been standing around Maria's desk found themselves moving toward chairs without making conscious decisions to do so. Even Derek, who had spent years dominating others through size and aggression, discovered that his legs were carrying him toward his seat despite his bewilderment about why he was obeying. Ashley's phone, which had been recording the anticipated breakdown, trembled in her hands as she struggled to understand what was happening. The substitute teacher who had been their entertainment for weeks was looking directly at her now, and the eye contact was more uncomfortable than anything she had ever experienced. There was something predatory about that gaze, something that Suggested Ashley was being evaluated for weaknesses by someone who knew exactly how to exploit them. "Turn off the camera," Maria said, her words directed at Ashley but somehow audible to everyone in the room. "Delete the videos. Delete the group chat. Delete everything you've recorded of me. Do it now." Ashley's fingers moved across her phone screen without her conscious permission, her muscle memory responding to the command authority in Maria's voice, while her mind reeled with confusion about why she was complying. The live stream ended abruptly, leaving her followers confused about the technical difficulties that had interrupted their entertainment. Ryan, who specialized in psychological manipulation and had never encountered anyone immune to his techniques, found himself unable to formulate words. The sharp wit that he used to dissect other people's vulnerabilities had abandoned him completely, leaving him speechless in the face of someone whose psychological presence was unlike anything in his experience. "You want to know about my background?" Maria said, her voice still quiet but now carrying undertones of steel that made the classroom feel smaller and more dangerous. "You want to know what I did before teaching? I'll tell you exactly what I did, and then you're going to understand why your little games end today." She moved from behind the teacher's desk with fluid grace that belonged in a different environment. Entirely. Each step was precisely placed, her weight distributed with the balance of someone who had trained for combat situations where a misplaced foot could mean death. The cardigan and sensible shoes couldn't disguise the predatory movement, patterns that spoke of years spent preparing for violence. "My name is Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Army, retired," she said as she positioned herself in the center of the classroom where every student could see her clearly. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. I led convoys through hostile territory where improvised explosive devices could turn vehicles into shrapnel at any moment. I coordinated defensive positions during firefights with insurgents who wanted nothing more than to kill every American they could find." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as students processed information that shattered their assumptions about the woman they had been tormenting. Derek's face had gone pale as he realized that the person he had been intimidating possessed combat experience that made his wrestling achievements seem like children's games. "I earned my black belt in Taekwondo while stationed in South Korea," Maria continued, her voice maintaining the same controlled intensity that made every word feel like a physical impact. "I added Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu during my 2nd deployment, because hand-to-hand combat skills were necessary for survival in close-quarter situations. I have been trained to kill with my bare hands by people who considered violence a necessary tool for protecting freedom." Marcus, whose wrestling background had given him confidence in physical confrontations, found himself reassessing every assumption he had made about comparative skill levels. The woman standing before them was describing training that existed in a completely different category from high school athletics, and his body language reflected the unconscious recognition that he was outclassed beyond his ability to comprehend. "I commanded soldiers who faced death every day and followed my orders because they trusted my judgment to keep them alive," Maria said as she began walking slowly around the perimeter of the classroom, making eye contact with each student as she passed. "I made decisions under pressure that determined whether people lived or died. I carried responsibility for lives that mattered far more than your comfort or entertainment." Connor, who had spent weeks making juvenile jokes about her boring administrative background, was discovering that actual military service bore no resemblance to the video games and movies that had shaped his understanding of combat. The woman he had dismissed as weak had survived situations that would have broken him mentally before they killed him physically. "For 18 months, I have been substitute teaching because I believed that education mattered and that young people deserved patient guidance as they learned to navigate the world," Maria continued, her voice carrying disappointment that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "I thought that if I remained gentle and non-threatening, You might eventually recognize that learning was more valuable than entertainment. Timothy, who had betrayed his initial sympathy for Maria in favor of social acceptance, was beginning to understand the magnitude of his moral failure. He had aligned himself with bullies who were targeting someone whose service to their country should have earned automatic respect, and his shame was visible in the way he couldn't meet her eyes. "I was wrong," Maria said as she completed her circuit of the classroom and returned to face the students from the front of the room. "You interpreted gentleness as weakness. You mistook patience for helplessness. You assumed that someone who chose not to retaliate was someone who couldn't retaliate. Those assumptions were incorrect." The revelation was sinking in with the force of a physical blow as students realized they had been psychologically torturing a decorated combat veteran who possessed skills they couldn't imagine. The power dynamic they thought they understood had been completely inverted, and they were beginning to grasp that their victim had been choosing restraint rather than experiencing helplessness. "The woman you thought you were breaking never existed," Maria said with finality that carried the weight of absolute truth. "She was a character I created because I hoped you might respond to kindness better than force. But since you've made it clear that respect must be earned through demonstration rather than assumption, it's time for you to meet the real Maria Santos." The air in room 247 crackled with tension as Maria's revelation settled over the students like a suffocating blanket. Derek, who had built his entire identity around physical dominance, found himself staring at someone whose combat credentials made his high school athletic achievements seem pathetically insignificant. His hands, which had seemed so threatening when reaching for her bag, now trembled slightly as the implications of her military background became clear. 15 years of active duty, Maria continued, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone delivering a tactical briefing. "I survived mortar attacks that would have reduced this entire building to rubble. I've been shot at by trained killers who considered American soldiers legitimate targets for elimination. I've seen friends die in explosions that happened without warning in places where we thought we were safe." She removed her wire-rimmed glasses with deliberate slowness, folding them carefully before placing them on the desk. Without the scholarly accessory, her face revealed angular features that spoke of discipline and determination rather than academic gentleness. Her brown eyes, no longer hidden behind reflective lenses, held depths that spoke of experiences these teenagers couldn't begin to comprehend. "During my second tour in Afghanistan, our convoy was ambushed by insurgents who had been planning the attack for weeks," Maria said as she began rolling up the sleeves of her cardigan with methodical precision. 6 vehicles, 30 soldiers, surrounded by hostile forces in terrain that offered no cover and no escape routes. The engagement lasted 4 hours. Marcus, whose wrestling accomplishments had earned him respect throughout the school district, was beginning to understand that athletic competition bore no resemblance to life-and-death combat. The controlled violence of sports existed in a completely different universe from the brutal reality that Maria was describing, and his confident assumptions about physical confrontation were crumbling. "I was the ranking non-commissioned officer when our lieutenant was wounded in the first minutes of the firefight," Maria continued, her movements becoming more fluid as she shed the artificially constrained posture she had maintained for weeks. "Command responsibility fell to me because rank structure doesn't pause for fear or uncertainty. 30 lives depended on my decisions, and failure meant that none of us would return home to our families." Ashley's phone lay forgotten in her lap as she struggled to reconcile the woman standing before them with the pathetic figure they had been tormenting through social media campaigns. The substitute teacher who had seemed so vulnerable to psychological manipulation was revealing herself to be someone who had commanded respect in environments where weakness meant death. "We fought our way out of that ambush because I made tactical decisions under pressure while bullets were splitting the air around my head," Maria said as she removed her cardigan entirely, revealing arms that showed the lean muscle definition. of someone who maintained military fitness standards years after leaving active service. Every soldier in that convoy went home alive because I refused to let fear or doubt interfere with my responsibility to protect the people under my command. Ryan, whose specialty had been psychological warfare designed to break down his victims' mental defenses, was discovering that his amateur techniques were useless against someone who had been trained to resist interrogation by professionals. The cruel wit that had seemed so effective against fellow teenagers was revealing itself to be powerless against someone who had faced real psychological pressure in actual combat situations. After that engagement, my commanding officer recommended me for the Bronze Star Medal, Maria said, her voice carrying quiet pride rather than boastfulness. Not because I was heroic, but because I did my job under circumstances that required me to function effectively while other people were trying to kill me. That's what soldiers do. We perform our duties regardless of the obstacles or opposition we face. The classroom had become a museum of shocked silence as students processed information that completely destroyed their preconceptions about authority and strength. Connor, who had made jokes about her boring administrative background, was beginning to understand that military service involved responsibilities and consequences that existed on a scale he had never imagined. My martial arts training began as a practical necessity for survival in close-quarters combat situations. Maria continued as she moved to the center of the classroom with predatory grace that made students instinctively lean away from her path. Hand-to-hand combat skills aren't optional when your life depends on your ability to neutralize threats efficiently and decisively. She demonstrated a basic fighting stance that transformed her entire presence from academic to lethal. Her feet found perfect balance, her hands positioned for both defense and attack, her center of gravity lowered for maximum stability and power generation. The movement was so fluid and natural that it was clearly the result of thousands of hours of practice and refinement. Taekwondo provided the foundation for kicks and strikes that could disable armed opponents. Maria explained as she shifted into a different stance that emphasized mobility and precision. The Olympic-style competition forms were useful for fitness and flexibility, but the traditional combat applications were what kept me alive when survival depended on ending fights quickly and decisively. Derek, who had used his size advantage to intimidate smaller students for years, was beginning to grasp that physical dominance had very little to do with actual fighting ability. The woman who stood barely over 5 feet tall was demonstrating movement patterns that spoke of training designed for situations where losing meant dying. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became essential when I realized that combat situations don't always allow for striking techniques. Maria continued as she transitioned into a grappling stance that made her appear even more dangerous despite the apparent vulnerability of being closer to potential opponents. Ground fighting skills were necessary because real violence doesn't follow the rules of organized sports or respectful competition. Timothy, who had abandoned his moral principles in favor of social acceptance, was confronting the reality that he had participated in tormenting someone whose service had protected the very freedoms that allowed him to attend school safely. The magnitude of his betrayal was becoming clear as he understood the character and sacrifice of the person he had helped humiliate. I earned my black belt rankings through testing that involved full contact sparring against opponents who were trying to win rather than trying to avoid injury, Maria said as she demonstrated a combination of strikes and blocks that flowed together with lethal efficiency. Military training doesn't include safety equipment or protective gear because real combat doesn't provide those luxuries. The demonstration was brief but devastating in its implications. Every movement revealed years of training designed for situations where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury that could cost lives. The teenagers who had thought they understood violence through movies and video games were confronting someone who had learned it through necessity in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. For 3 years, I taught hand-to-hand Combat techniques to soldiers who were preparing for deployment to active combat zones, Maria concluded as she returned to a relaxed but ready posture that somehow seemed more threatening than her aggressive stances had been. I trained people to survive encounters with enemies who wanted to kill them, and my students trusted my instruction because they knew my experience was earned through actual combat rather than theoretical study. The revelation was complete, and the students who had spent weeks tormenting their substitute teacher were beginning to understand that they had been playing children's games with someone who operated according to rules they had never imagined. The power dynamic they thought they controlled had been an illusion, and the real authority in the room was about to demonstrate exactly what that meant for their continued behavior. The confrontation reached its climax when Derek, his adolescent ego unable to process the complete destruction of his worldview, made the fatal mistake of interpreting Maria's controlled revelation as a bluff designed to intimidate rather than a warning of genuine capability. His face flushed, red with a mixture of embarrassment and rage as he struggled to reconcile his weeks of successful bullying with the combat veteran now standing before him. "You think you can scare us with war stories?" Derek snarled as he rose from his chair, his 6'2" frame towering over Maria's smaller stature in what he hoped would restore his psychological dominance. "I don't care what you did in some desert on the other side of the world. This is Riverside High, not Afghanistan, and you're still just a pathetic substitute teacher who can't control her classroom." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, and Maria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly from disappointed teacher to combat-ready soldier. Her brown eyes, which had shown patience and understanding throughout weeks of harassment, now held the cold calculation of someone who had been forced to eliminate threats to survive another day. "Stand down," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had given orders in life-and-death situations. "Sit back down, take a deep breath, and think very carefully about your next decision. Because whatever happens in the next 60 seconds will determine how the rest of your life unfolds." Derek's response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between them to approximately 3 feet while puffing out his chest in what he believed was an intimidating display of physical superiority. Or what? He demanded with the false bravado of someone who had never faced real consequences for his aggressive behavior. "You're going to fight me? A little old lady substitute teacher is going to take on the captain of the wrestling team." Marcus, whose competitive wrestling experience had given him enough understanding of body mechanics to recognize genuine fighting capability when he saw it, grabbed Derek's arm in an attempt to prevent what was about to become a catastrophic miscalculation. "Derek, don't," he whispered urgently, his voice tight with the kind of fear that comes from recognizing superior skill in a potential opponent. "Something's wrong here. This isn't what we thought." But Derek shook off his friends. Restraint in hand, his teenage pride and social status too invested in the confrontation to allow for strategic retreat. "Get off me, Marcus," he snapped without taking his eyes off Maria, who remained perfectly still in the center of the classroom. "I'm not going to be intimidated by some washed-up soldier who probably got kicked out of the military for being too weak to handle real combat." The insult to her service and the implication that her military career had ended in disgrace crossed a line that Maria had been carefully avoiding throughout weeks of escalating harassment. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and students who were watching closely noticed that her breathing had shifted to a pattern that suggested preparation for explosive physical activity. "Last warning," Maria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper while somehow becoming more audible than shouting would have been. "Walk away, sit down, choose a different path. Because if you take one more step toward me, I will treat you as a hostile threat that needs to be neutralized, and your high school wrestling experience will not prepare you for what happens next." Derek's response was to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound that revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about the situation he had created. Neutralized? He mocked as he took the final step that would trigger consequences he was completely unprepared to face. "Lady, you watch too many action movies. This is real life. And in real life, big strong men don't get beaten up by tiny middle-aged women who couldn't even control a classroom full of teenagers." The attack, when it came, was clumsy and telegraphed, exactly what Maria had expected. From someone whose fighting experience was limited to organized sports with rules, referees, and safety considerations. Derek threw a wild haymaker punch aimed at her head, the kind of uncontrolled swing that might have been effective against another untrained teenager but was pathetically inadequate against someone with genuine combat training. Maria's response was instantaneous and devastating. She stepped inside Derek's swing with footwork that belonged in a different universe from high school athletics, her movement so fluid and natural that it seemed like she had somehow anticipated his attack before he had decided to throw it. Her left hand intercepted his extended arm while her right drove forward in a precise strike that connected with his solar plexus with surgical accuracy. The impact drove every molecule of air from Derek's lungs while sending shockwaves through his nervous system that his brain couldn't process. He doubled over involuntarily, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as he struggled to remember how breathing was supposed to work. The confident smirk that had been his trademark expression was replaced by wide-eyed panic as he realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his assumptions about this confrontation. Before Derek could begin to recover from the first strike, Maria followed up with a knee that connected with his descending face with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a sledgehammer. The sound of cartilage breaking was audible throughout the silent classroom as Derek's nose exploded in a fountain of blood that spattered across the floor in abstract patterns that would remain in students' nightmares for years. Derek staggered backward, both hands flying to his ruined face as blood streamed between his fingers and dripped onto his expensive Letterman jacket. His green eyes, which had sparkled with cruel confidence just moments before, now showed the glassy confusion of someone whose brain was struggling to process trauma while his body fought to remain conscious. "You broke my nose." He gasped through the blood that was filling his mouth and making speech difficult. "You actually broke my nose. You can't do that. You're a teacher. Teachers aren't allowed to hurt students." Maria's expression remained coldly professional as she evaluated Derek's condition with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen far worse injuries in combat situations. "You attacked me," she stated with the matter-of-fact tone of someone documenting facts for an after-action report. "I defended myself using appropriate force to neutralize a physical threat. That's exactly what I'm allowed to do, and it's exactly what I was trained to do." The classroom had erupted in chaos as students scrambled away from the confrontation, their chairs scraping across the floor as they pressed themselves against the walls in desperate attempts to increase their distance from the violence they had never expected to witness. Several were crying, others were hyperventilating, and all were discovering that real violence bore no resemblance to the entertainment they consumed through movies and video games. Marcus, who had tried to prevent the confrontation, was staring at his best friend's bloody face with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. His wrestling background had given him enough understanding of physical combat to recognize that Derek had been completely outclassed from the moment he decided to escalate from verbal harassment to physical assault. Ashley's phone had fallen to the floor during her panicked retreat from the center of the action. Its screen cracked from the impact, but still recording the aftermath of Derek's devastating encounter with someone whose fighting skills existed in a completely different category from anything these students had imagined possible. Ryan, whose psychological manipulation techniques had seemed so effective during weeks of systematic harassment, was pressed against the far wall with tears streaming down his face as he confronted the reality that actions could have consequences that extended far beyond social embarrassment or parental disappointment. Connor had crawled under his desk and was whimpering softly as he tried to make himself invisible, his mind unable to process the transformation of their victim into someone who possessed the capability to inflict serious physical damage on anyone who threatened her. The boring substitute teacher who had seemed so helpless was revealing herself to be someone who could end their harassment permanently through methods they had never considered. Timothy was vomiting into a trash can as his nervous system responded to witnessing violence that was fundamentally different from the sanitized conflicts he had seen in entertainment media. The reality of blood and broken bones and genuine physical damage was overwhelming his sheltered, suburban sensibilities and forcing him to confront the consequences of the cruelty he had participated in. Derek himself was still standing, though. His legs were shaking, and his face was a mask of blood that made it difficult to assess the full extent of his injuries. His breathing was labored and painful, and every attempt to speak resulted in fresh streams of blood that suggested internal damage beyond the obviously broken nose. "Sit down before you fall down," Maria commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taken control of chaotic situations through decisive action. "Put pressure on your nose to slow the bleeding. Tilt your head forward so the blood doesn't run down your throat. And think very carefully about whether you want to continue this confrontation, or if you're ready to accept that your assessment of the situation was incorrect." The demonstration was complete, and every student in room 247 now understood that their weeks of harassment had been targeting someone who possessed the training and willingness to defend herself through methods that belonged in a completely different category from their previous experience with authority figures. The aftermath of Derek's defeat rippled through Riverside High like shockwaves from an earthquake, fundamentally altering the social landscape in ways that no one could have predicted. Within hours of the confrontation, word had spread throughout the entire school district about the substitute teacher who had hospitalized the wrestling team captain with her bare hands, and the story grew more dramatic with each retelling. Principal Morgan arrived at the school within 30 minutes of receiving the emergency call, his usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic as he tried to understand how a routine disciplinary situation had escalated into what the school nurse was describing as significant facial trauma requiring immediate medical attention. The blood-stained classroom and Derek's obvious injuries suggested a level of violence that had no precedent in his administrative experience. "Mrs. Santos," Principal Morgan said as he entered room 247, where Maria was calmly organizing papers, while maintenance staff cleaned blood from the floor, "I need you to explain exactly what happened here. The students are saying that you attacked Derek Matthews without provocation, but that doesn't align with your reputation as a professional educator." Maria looked up from her desk with the same gentle expression she had worn during weeks of harassment, though Principal Morgan noticed something different in her posture that he couldn't quite identify. "Derek became physically aggressive and I defended myself using appropriate force," she replied in the measured tone of someone delivering a formal report. "Everything that occurred was captured on multiple student phones, so there should be clear documentation of the sequence of events." The investigation that followed revealed a shocking pattern of systematic harassment that had been occurring under the FI administration's radar for weeks. Ashley's social media accounts, which she had frantically tried to delete during the chaos following Derek's defeat, were recovered by the district's IT department and provided overwhelming evidence of the coordinated campaign that had targeted Maria. Operation Breakdown, as Ashley had named their group chat, contained hundreds of messages documenting their psychological warfare tactics, including detailed plans for humiliation, photographs of vandalized teaching materials, and celebratory reactions to Maria's apparent distress. The digital evidence painted a picture of sustained cruelty that horrified administrators who had previously viewed the involved students as model citizens. the security camera footage from the hallway outside room 247, though it couldn't capture audio, clearly showed Derek taking an aggressive stance and throwing the first punch while Maria remained in a defensive position until the moment she was forced to protect herself. The video evidence corroborated her account entirely and demolished any claims that she had initiated the physical confrontation. Parents began arriving at the school in waves as news of the incident spread through the community's social networks. Derek's mother, Patricia Matthews, arrived at the emergency room where her son was receiving treatment for his broken nose and mild concussion, her face a mask of fury as she demanded answers about how a school employee had been allowed to assault her child. "I don't care what Derek said or did," Patricia declared to anyone who would listen, her voice rising to near hysteria as she processed the sight of her son's bandaged face. "There is no excuse for an adult to physically attack a minor. I'm calling my lawyer, and I'm going to make sure that woman never works in education again." However, Patricia's righteous indignation began to crumble when Principal Morgan presented her with printouts of the Operation Breakdown messages, including several where Derek had explicitly detailed his plans to make Maria's life a living hell until she quits or has a nervous breakdown. The evidence of her son's leadership role in systematic harassment campaign left her speechless and forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about the child she thought she knew. The other parents involved faced similar reckonings as the scope of their children's behavior became clear. Marcus's father, a prominent attorney who had initially threatened legal action against the school district, withdrew his complaints after reviewing the digital evidence and realizing that his son's wrestling scholarship prospects would be seriously damaged by association with the harassment campaign. Ashley's parents, who had built their social media marketing business around their daughter's online influence, watched in horror as sponsors began distancing themselves from the family brand after clips of the classroom confrontation went viral. The teenager who had monetized her cruelty was discovering that actions in the digital age carried consequences that extended far beyond high school social dynamics. The student body's reaction to Derek's defeat was complex and multifaceted, revealing the hidden tensions that had existed beneath Riverside High's veneer of academic excellence and athletic achievement. Many students who had silently endured bullying from Derek and his crew felt a sense of vindication that bordered on celebration, though they were careful to express their satisfaction only in private conversations. Sarah Kim, the honors student, who had remained silent during weeks of harassment, found herself able to speak openly for the first time since the campaign against Maria had begun. "I knew what they were doing was wrong," she confided to friends during lunch, "but I was too scared to say anything because I didn't want to become their next target. Seeing Derek get what he deserved made me realize that bullies aren't as powerful as they want everyone to believe." The few students who had genuinely tried to befriend Maria during her time at the school were experiencing their own complex emotions as they processed the revelation of her military background. Jennifer Walsh, a quiet sophomore who had occasionally asked respectful questions about the lesson material, felt both vindicated in her positive assessment of Maria's character and disturbed by her own naivety about the harassment that had been occurring around her. "She was always so kind and patient with everyone," Jennifer told her parents that evening, her voice reflecting confusion about how someone so gentle could also be capable of such decisive violence. "I never would have guessed that she was a combat veteran, but it explains why she never seemed intimidated by Derek and his friends, even when they were being really cruel to her." The teaching staff at Riverside High were grappling with their own professional and ethical questions about the incident. Several teachers admitted privately that they had noticed the escalating disrespect toward Maria, but had assumed it was typical substitute teacher hazing that would resolve itself naturally. The revelation that their colleague had been enduring systematic psychological abuse while they remained oblivious forced them to examine their own awareness and responsibility. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian who had been one of the few staff members to show Maria consistent kindness, felt particularly guilty about her failure to recognize the severity of the situation. "I knew those boys were trouble," she confided to Principal Morgan during a private meeting, "but I thought Maria was handling it appropriately by not escalating conflicts. I never imagined they were conducting such a vicious campaign against her." The district's legal team worked frantically to assess their liability exposure while trying to balance support for Maria with concerns about potential lawsuits from parents of the involved students. The clear evidence of Derek's aggressive behavior and the documented harassment campaign provided strong justification for Maria's actions, but the optics of a teacher physically injuring a student created public relations challenges that required careful management. Superintendent Williams called an emergency meeting with the school board to address the incident and its implications for district policies regarding substitute teacher support and student disciplinary procedures. The revelation that systematic harassment had occurred without administrative awareness highlighted serious gaps in their monitoring systems and raised questions about how many other incidents might have been overlooked. "This situation represents a complete failure of our protective systems," Superintendent Williams acknowledged during the closed-door meeting. "We employed a decorated military veteran as a substitute teacher and then failed to provide her with the support necessary to prevent sustained harassment from students who should have been disciplined weeks before this confrontation occurred." The broader community response was equally divided, with social media platforms becoming battlegrounds between those who supported Maria's right to self-defense and those who argued that violence was never appropriate in educational settings. Local news stations picked up the story, and Maria found herself at the center of a regional debate about teacher authority, student discipline, and the appropriate response to workplace harassment. Combat veterans organizations rallied to Maria's defense, pointing out that her years of military service had earned her the right to work without harassment and that her defensive actions were entirely appropriate given the circumstances. Veterans Affairs counselors noted that the incident highlighted the challenges faced by former military personnel as they transitioned to civilian careers where their training and experience were often misunderstood or undervalued. The psychological impact on the students who had witnessed Derek's defeat extended far beyond the immediate shock of seeing violence in their classroom. Many were experiencing nightmares, anxiety attacks, and difficulty concentrating on academic work as they processed the realization that their assumptions about power, authority, and consequences had been fundamentally incorrect. School counselors worked overtime to provide support for students who were struggling to understand how their entertainment had transformed into trauma, while also trying to help them process the guilt and shame associated with their participation in passive or silent acceptance of the harassment campaign that had led to the confrontation. The incident had fundamentally altered the social dynamics at Riverside High, creating a new reality where students understood that authority figures might possess capabilities they hadn't imagined, and that actions could have consequences that extended far beyond their previous experience with discipline and accountability. Transformation of Maria Santos from perceived victim to respected authority figure happened with surprising speed, though the process was neither simple nor without complications. Within a week of the confrontation, she had been offered a permanent position teaching advanced placement history at Riverside High, a role that Principal Morgan presented as both an apology for the administration's failure to protect her and recognition of her unique qualifications for working with challenging students. "Mrs. Santos," Principal Morgan said during their private meeting in his office, his tone carrying the respect that had been absent from their previous interactions. "Your military background and demonstrated ability to handle difficult situations make you exactly the kind of educator we need. These students have learned that actions have consequences, and they need consistent leadership from someone who won't be intimidated by their previous behavior patterns." Maria accepted the position with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained throughout her ordeal, though she insisted on implementing significant changes to classroom management protocols and student accountability measures. Her first requirement was the installation of security cameras in all classrooms, ensuring that future incidents of harassment would be documented and addressed before they could escalate to physical confrontation. The students who returned to her classroom after Derek's hospitalization were fundamentally different from the confident predators who had tormented her weeks earlier. Marcus, whose wrestling skills had seemed so impressive before he witnessed real combat capability, now sat in the front row and addressed Maria as ma'am with the automatic respect that military personnel commanded from those who understood the significance of service. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for my behavior and for not stopping Derek when I knew he was making a serious mistake," Marcus said after class one day, his voice carrying genuine shame rather than the calculated manipulation that had characterized his previous communications. "My father served in Vietnam, and he explained to me what your military record really means. I should have recognized that we were disrespecting someone who deserved our gratitude, not our harassment." Ashley's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic as her social media empire crumbled under the weight of public backlash and sponsor withdrawals following the viral spread of classroom footage. The teenager who had built her identity around online influence found herself attending mandatory counseling sessions while facing potential criminal charges for cyberbullying and harassment under newly enacted state legislation. "I keep thinking about all those messages we sent," Ashley confided to the school counselor during one of their sessions, tears streaming down her face as she grappled with the magnitude of her cruelty. "We thought it was funny to make her miserable, but she was protecting our freedom while we were still in elementary school. How could we be so awful to someone who sacrificed so much for people like us?" Ryan, whose psychological manipulation tactics had proven useless against someone with genuine mental toughness, underwent his own painful process of self-examination as he confronted the reality that his clever cruelty had been targeting a combat veteran who possessed inner strength he couldn't comprehend. His parents enrolled him in therapy after discovering the full extent of his participation in the harassment campaign. "I thought I was smart because I could make people feel bad about themselves," Ryan admitted during a family therapy session, his voice barely audible as he processed his own moral failures. "But Mrs. Santos survived things that would have broken me completely, and I was trying to hurt her feelings with stupid insults about her clothes and her voice. I feel like such a pathetic loser." Connor's response to the revelation of Maria's background was to withdraw almost completely from social interaction, his gregarious personality replaced by quiet introspection as he tried to understand how he had become someone who participated in tormenting a military hero. His academic performance, which had been declining due to his focus on social dynamics and harassment activities, began improving as he redirected his energy toward actually learning. Timothy faced perhaps the most complex emotional journey, as his betrayal of someone he had initially sympathized with forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own moral character and susceptibility to peer pressure. The knowledge that he had abandoned his principles to join in persecuting a decorated veteran created shame that manifested in physical symptoms, including insomnia and loss of appetite. "I knew what we were doing was wrong," Timothy wrote in a letter to Maria that he never found the courage to deliver, "but I was too scared of becoming a target myself to stand up for you. Now I understand that you're the kind of person who would have protected me if I had been brave enough to do what was right. I failed the test of character, and I don't know how to live with that knowledge." The broader student body's relationship with Maria evolved as word spread about her military service and the circumstances surrounding Derek's hospitalization. Students who had previously ignored her began approaching her desk with genuine questions about historical topics, while others sought her advice about college applications and career planning, recognizing that her life experience provided perspectives unavailable from traditional educators. Mrs. Santos asked Jennifer Walsh during one after-school conversation, "What was it like being one of the few women in combat units? I'm thinking about applying to military academies, but I'm worried about whether I'm strong enough to handle that kind of environment." Maria's response reflected the thoughtful mentorship that had always been available to students who approached her with respect and genuine interest. "Strength isn't just physical," she explained, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had proven herself in environments where failure meant death. "Military service teaches you that mental toughness and moral courage are more important than size or natural athletic ability. The question isn't whether you're strong enough now, but whether you're willing to develop the strength that service requires." These conversations revealed an aspect of Maria's character that had been hidden during the weeks of harassment: her genuine passion for education and her ability to connect military discipline with academic achievement. Students discovered that her combat experience provided unique insights into leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of teamwork that enhanced rather than distracted from traditional historical instruction. The veteran community's response to Maria's situation had created unexpected opportunities for educational enrichment at Riverside High. Local veterans of foreign wars chapters began offering guest speaking opportunities, while military recruiters started visiting the school to discuss service opportunities with students who had been inspired by Maria's example. "Ma'am, I never really understood what military service meant until I learned about your background," said David Chen, Marcus's younger brother, during a classroom discussion about the role of citizen soldiers in American democracy. "My grandfather served in Korea, but he never talked about it much. Now I'm wondering if I should ask him more questions about his experiences." Maria's teaching methodology incorporated lessons learned from military leadership training, emphasizing personal accountability, team cohesion, and mission accomplishment in ways that transformed her classroom dynamics. Students who had previously viewed education as entertainment discovered that learning required discipline and commitment that paralleled military training in its demands for excellence. The incident had also prompted significant policy changes throughout the school district, as administrators recognized that their previous approaches to substitute teacher support had been inadequate. New protocols required immediate intervention when harassment was reported, while enhanced background checks ensured that schools could better match educator qualifications with challenging assignments. Principal Morgan established a mentorship program pairing veteran educators with substitutes, ensuring that temporary staff received the support necessary to maintain classroom authority without feeling isolated when facing difficult students. The program was named in Maria's honor, recognizing her role in highlighting systemic failures that had affected numerous educators throughout the district. The Santos Protocol, as staff began calling the new procedures, required administrators to personally observe substitute teachers during their first week of assignment, providing both support and documentation that could prevent future harassment incidents from escalating to the point where physical confrontation became necessary. The long-term psychological impact on Derek, who remained hospitalized for several days due to complications from his injuries, included a fundamental reassessment of his worldview and behavior patterns. His parents enrolled him in anger management counseling while also requiring him to research military service and veteran affairs as part of his education about respect and consequences. "I keep thinking about how I could have been so wrong about someone," Derek admitted to his counselor weeks after the incident, his voice still affected by the nasal reconstruction surgery that had been required to repair the damage from Maria's defensive strike. "I thought being big and loud made me powerful, but she's probably 5 feet tall, and she destroyed me without even trying hard. I don't understand anything about real strength." The transformation of room 247 from a site of harassment to a place of learning reflected the broader changes that had occurred throughout the school community. Students who entered Maria's classroom now did so with awareness that they were in the presence of someone whose life experience commanded respect, and their behavior reflected that understanding in ways that created an environment conducive to actual education. 6 months after the confrontation that had changed everything, Maria Santos stood before her advanced placement history class with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the civilian world. The transformation of room 247 was complete. Gone were the scattered papers and disrespectful chatter, replaced by engaged students who understood that they were receiving instruction from someone whose life experience extended far beyond academic theory. The morning sunlight streamed through windows that now looked out on a campus where respect had replaced intimidation as the dominant social force. Students who passed Maria in the hallways offered genuine greetings rather than cruel whispers, and her presence had become a stabilizing influence that extended throughout the entire school community. Derek Matthews returned to school after 2 months of medical treatment and mandatory counseling, his face bearing faint scars that served as permanent reminders of the lesson he had learned about the difference between perceived strength and actual capability. His approach to Maria's classroom on his first day back was hesitant, his previous swagger replaced by the careful movements of someone who had been fundamentally humbled. "Mrs. Santos," Derek said quietly as he approached her desk after the final bell, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions. "I wanted to speak with you before I start attending your class again. I know that an apology isn't enough to make up for what I did, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong I was about everything." Maria looked up from her grading with the same gentle expression she had always possessed, though Derek could now see the steel beneath the kindness that he had been too blind to recognize months earlier. "Apologies are a starting point, not a destination," she replied with the measured tone of someone who had learned to evaluate sincerity through years of dealing with people whose words couldn't always be trusted. "What matters is whether you've learned something that will change how you treat people going forward." Derek nodded earnestly, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to find words adequate to express the magnitude of his transformation. "I've been reading about military service and what soldiers go through in combat zones," he said, his voice breaking with emotion as he continued. "I can't believe we spent weeks torturing someone who had already sacrificed so much for our country. I'm ashamed of who I was, and I want to become someone better." The conversation that followed was the first of many that would occur over the coming months as Maria worked with Derek and the other former harassers to help them understand the difference between dominance through intimidation and leadership through service. Her military experience had taught her that even the most misguided individuals could be transformed through proper guidance and accountability. Marcus Chen had undergone his own remarkable transformation, channeling his competitive drive into academic achievement while using his wrestling skills to mentor younger students who were struggling with bullying. His father's military service in Vietnam had provided a framework for understanding Maria's background, and Marcus had become one of her most dedicated students. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about military service after graduation," Marcus confided during one of their after-school conversations about college and career planning. "Not because I want to fight, but because I want to serve something larger than myself. You've shown me that real strength comes from protecting others, not from hurting them." Maria's response reflected the thoughtful mentorship that had become her signature as an educator. "Military service isn't the only way to serve your country and community," she explained, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to see beyond her own experience. "What matters is that you find a way to use your talents and energy to make the world better than you found it." Ashley Rodriguez had perhaps traveled the furthest distance in her personal journey, transforming from a social media influencer who monetized cruelty into an anti-bullying advocate who used her communication skills to promote kindness and understanding. Her family's marketing business had pivoted to working with veterans organizations, creating content that honored military service rather than exploiting teenage drama. Mrs. Santos helped me understand that influence comes with responsibility. Ashley explained during a presentation to middle school students about the dangers of cyberbullying. I used my platform to hurt someone who had spent years protecting our freedom, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But she's also taught me that redemption is possible if you're willing to do the hard work of becoming a better person. The ripple effects of Maria's influence extended throughout the Riverside High community in ways that surprised even her. Teachers began incorporating military history and veteran experiences into their curriculum, while students started volunteer programs supporting local veterans organizations. The school's culture had shifted from one that tolerated cruelty to one that celebrated service and sacrifice. Principal Morgan had implemented comprehensive policy changes based on lessons learned from the harassment campaign against Maria. Procedures required immediate intervention when substitute teachers reported disrespectful behavior, while enhanced training helped administrators recognize the warning signs of systematic bullying before it could escalate to dangerous levels. Mrs. Santos's experience forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our school culture. Principal Morgan acknowledged during a district-wide meeting about improving substitute teacher support. We learned that academic achievement and athletic success mean nothing if we're not also teaching students about character, respect, and the importance of protecting those who serve our community. The veteran community's response to Maria's situation had created lasting partnerships between Riverside High and local military organizations. Guest speakers regularly visited classes to share their experiences, while students participated in community service projects supporting veteran families and military charities. These connections had enriched the educational experience, while creating awareness about the sacrifices made by military personnel. Walsh's transformation had been perhaps the most profound, as his natural intelligence was redirected from psychological manipulation toward genuine academic achievement. His parents' decision to seek therapy had uncovered underlying insecurities that had driven his cruel behavior, and his newfound understanding of empathy had made him a powerful advocate for kindness and inclusion. I used to think that being smart meant finding ways to make other people feel stupid. Ryan reflected during a peer counseling session where he shared his experience with younger students. Mrs. Santos showed me that real intelligence involves understanding and protecting others, not tearing them down for entertainment. The classroom that had once been a battleground for psychological warfare had become a sanctuary for learning where students felt safe to ask questions, express opinions, and engage with complex historical concepts without fear of ridicule or harassment. Maria's military discipline created structure, while her educational philosophy encouraged intellectual curiosity and critical thinking. Jennifer Walsh, who had always been respectful toward Maria, had blossomed under the mentorship of someone who combined academic knowledge with real-world experience. Her college application essays about Maria's influence had earned her admission to several prestigious universities, and she planned to study international relations with the goal of working in veteran affairs. Mrs. Santos taught me that history isn't just about memorizing dates and events. Jennifer explained to her parents as she prepared for college. It's about understanding how individual choices and sacrifices shape the world we live in. Her military service gives her insights into historical events that no textbook could provide. The substitute teaching program throughout the district had been revolutionized based on Maria's experience, with new protocols ensuring that temporary educators received the support necessary to maintain classroom authority while building positive relationships with students. The changes had attracted higher quality candidates who were drawn to a district that demonstrated genuine commitment to educator welfare. Connor Thompson had redirected his social energy toward positive activities, becoming active in student government while using his communication skills to promote school spirit and community involvement. His transformation from class clown to student leader reflected the broader cultural shift that had occurred throughout Riverside High. Timothy Foster's journey toward redemption had been the most difficult, as his betrayal of his initial moral instincts had created deep shame that required ongoing counseling support. However, his experience had also made him a powerful voice for students who struggled with peer pressure and the temptation to compromise their values for social acceptance. Mrs. Santos never gave up on any of us, even after everything we put her through, Timothy said during the school assembly about second chances and personal growth. She showed us that making mistakes doesn't define who you are, but how you respond to those mistakes determines who you become. The legacy of Maria's time at Riverside High extended far beyond the individual transformations of her former tormentors. The school had become a model for other districts dealing with substitute teacher harassment, while Maria's story had inspired veterans organizations to develop programs supporting military personnel transitioning to civilian careers in education. As she stood before her students on a bright spring morning, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the classrooms of suburban America. The skills that had kept her alive in combat zones had proven equally valuable in civilian life, though the battles she fought now were for hearts and minds rather than territory and strategic objectives. The quiet woman who had once gathered scattered papers from the classroom floor had emerged as a respected educator whose influence would shape generations of students. Her story had become a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of service, and the truth that real strength comes not from the ability to inflict harm, but from the wisdom to know when that ability should be used to protect others from those who would abuse their power. 3 years later, Maria Santos stood at the podium of the National Educators Conference, addressing an audience of thousands about the transformative power of respect and second chances. Behind her, a PowerPoint slide displayed a photograph of her current advanced placement history class, including Derek, Marcus, Ashley, Ryan, and Timothy, all now college freshmen who credited her mentorship with changing their lives. The students who once tormented me are now some of my greatest success stories, Maria told the captivated audience. Derek volunteers at a veterans hospital while studying social work. Marcus earned an ROTC scholarship and plans to serve his country. Ashley runs an anti-bullying nonprofit that has reached thousands of young people. In the audience, Principal Morgan wiped away tears as he remembered the blood-stained classroom that had become a symbol of transformation rather than trauma. The substitute teacher program Maria had inspired was now a national model, protecting educators while creating opportunities for meaningful mentorship. True strength isn't about domination, Maria concluded, her voice carrying the authority earned through service and sacrifice. It's about lifting others up, even when they've tried to tear you down. Every veteran knows that our greatest victories come not from the battles we win, but from the peace we help create. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but Maria's real reward came in the messages from former students who had learned that courage meant standing up for others. That wisdom came from understanding your own power, and that the greatest teachers were those who helped you discover the hero within yourself. What would you do if faced with such relentless harassment? Could you have shown the same restraint and wisdom as Maria Santos? If this story of courage, transformation, and second chances inspired you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in human nature. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose character over convenience. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their quiet strength matters more than loud arrogance.